All right, we begin with developing news on the diplomatic efforts to end the war on Gaza. Reuters says it's obtained a draft document that says Hamas has proposed a three-stage ceasefire plan in response to Qatari and Egyptian mediators. It involves the exchange of Israeli captives captured by Hamas on October the 7th for Palestinian prisoners, securing the reconstruction of Gaza, ensuring the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces, and the exchanging of bodies. We have with us Hashem Ahelbarra. He's joining us here in Doha. I suppose, Hashem, the devil is in the detail. So what are you learning about this three-stage proposal?
Very interesting developments. Yesterday, when the Qatari Prime Minister, Sheikh Mohammed al-Rahman al-Thani, met with Blinken, both said that they believe the elements are there for a deal. The Qataris said that they were confident and that Hamas' response was positive. And then they said, we're not going to go into details because it's a very sensitive thing. It has to go now to the Israelis and the other ones to have to look into the details. Except that the document was leaked earlier today. And I know from our sources that the bulk of this is authentic. Hamas wants this to be a phased agreement that starts with the announcement of a truce of about 6 weeks, 45 days, in exchange for the release of Israeli captives, mostly women and the elderly. But when you look at the details of the agreement, they say, we would like to see Israeli troops pull out from the urban areas, populated areas, and relocate onto the suburbs. Humanitarian aid to be allowed. And within the first phase, we would like to maintain in direct talks with the Israelis, and which is going to be through the key mediators, Qatar and Egypt. Why they want this to happen? Because this is where they're going to have to agree on the criteria of every single phase of the agreement. I'll give you an example. So Hamas is saying we are going to release the women and the elderly in exchange for an unspecified number of Palestinians detained by Israel.
Right.
It's going to be up to the Qataris and to Egyptians to narrow the differences between Hamas and Israel. Now, we come to phase two, which is extremely crucial and important. They want to get guarantees that the Israelis are going to make an announcement of a permanent ceasefire. It's going to extend for 45 days, but during that period, they say they are going to release all the other captives, mostly soldiers.
Okay, so that's important then, because the soldiers are somewhat of Hamas's trump card, are they not?
That's the key component of their deal, because this is where they believe when it comes to that aspect, they are going to ask for a huge number of Palestinians detained in Israel to be released. And we're going to go back to the criteria itself and whether the Qataris and Egyptians will have more leverage to try to make sure that this succeeds. And this is where the Americans will have to have a say. Now, you go to phase three. So we're talking about now 90 days, almost 90 days, phase one and phase two. I'll tell you about the political calculus of Hamas when it comes to the phases of this agreement. They're going to exchange the remains of those who were killed, the Israeli captives killed. Hamas has been saying over the past few months that many of those captives were killed in Israeli bombardment in exchange for Hamas fighters who they say were killed, and they would like to get back their remains. At this phase, Hamas wants to ensure, and we're coming back now to their political calculus, that after almost 135 days, it becomes a new political reality, which is basically in 145 days, we didn't have any relentless bombardment, and therefore it becomes a political reality, and the ceasefire itself becomes a status quo. They do understand, I think one of the reasons why this document was leaked today is that Netanyahu and his war cabinet is looking into those details. They will have to come up with an answer to the Americans, to Blinken, and then who's going to come back to Qatar, and then after that we're likely to hear the official announcement of the agreement. But for the Israelis, it's also an extremely delicate thing to do because it's also about the personal political survival of Netanyahu.
Yeah.
And the way you have to sell it to your own people has to take into account that this is widely going to be seen as a dignified exit strategy. Same thing for Hamas, and particularly for its top command in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed al-Daif. Because when you look at what has been happening over the last 4 months, you cannot come back to the people of Gaza and say, you know what, we have a deal which falls short of the expectations of the people. We've seen the reaction of the people of Gaza over the last few weeks when they thought that suddenly an announcement was going to be imminent, and they took to the streets celebrating and they were so frustrated when they were told, no, you have to wait because it hasn't been finalized. Massive political pressure on Hamas and Israel as we speak to accept this agreement. And you see Hamas is trying to reinvent itself as a very practical, pragmatic element in this story by saying, you know what, we're becoming more receptive than ever to the demands of the international community, but more so for our own key partners or key mediators, the Egyptians and the Saudis. We don't want to be seen as the ones who are torpedoing this deal.
Look, Hashem, I mean, we do have Rory Challands standing by for us in occupied East Jerusalem, so in a moment I'll bring him in to find out what we can potentially expect from the Israelis, and Blinken, of course, is in Tel Aviv today. But let me ask you this, Hashem. Obviously, this is a big if, right? If the Israelis accept this or there are any changes to a ceasefire deal, is there anything in that leaked document that talks about who will guarantee the terms of any deal going forward?
I believe is going to be, I'm trying to go through the different elements of this agreement based on the same guarantees that were implemented during the first agreement that happened in late November, which is basically you have Egyptians operating across the border with their own people, the General Intelligence Directorate led by Abbas Kamel, and they are in touch with different factions in Gaza, and you have the Qataris who have been instrumental. Let me just explain to our viewers how this works. So each time it's like particularly when it comes to this agreement, it was handed over to the political bureau of Hamas based in Doha. But then they are not the ones who will have to have the final say. They send it back to Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed al-Daif.
Right.
Yahya is the top political leader in Gaza. Mohammed al-Daif is the top military commander. And you have to have their say. You have to have them on board, otherwise you won't have to have a deal. They will have to talk to their own people, top commanders, the founders of Hamas, those who have huge political, religious say in the strip. They will come back to the political bureau. The political bureau hands over the final answer to the Qataris. The Qataris will give it back to the Americans or to the Israelis. Exactly what happened within this one. Why is it critical? Why is it delicate? I think it's also an extremely delicate thing for the Americans, because when you saw yesterday Antony Blinken, he didn't mention a ceasefire. We do understand why, but at the same time he said that he thinks a deal is now possible. But the reason why he's going to Israel is to put more pressure on the Israelis to accommodate some of those demands for this deal to move forward. Because ultimately it's about the way it's going to be perceived by the Israelis and by the Palestinians. It's very crucial for the political survival of Hamas and more so for Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think it's going to come down to whether you will be able to look into those very small details of the agreement, implement them, and move forward. But as far as we are concerned, it is different than the first agreement. It's based on phases. It's very important for Hamas because they believe this time not anything shorter than a prolonged ceasefire is a big no.
Okay, Hashem, thank you so much for the time being. We'll now bring in Rory Challands, joining us from occupied East Jerusalem. Rory, so now we have this draft document that Hamas has proposed, this three-stage ceasefire plan, as Hashem was just explaining to us, Rory. What can we expect to happen in Tel Aviv today? Also, keeping in mind that you have the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who's there today, and he'll be meeting with Israeli officials.
Yeah, Blinken's got a very full day of diplomacy on Wednesday. First of all, he's meeting with Netanyahu. Then he's meeting with the Israeli chief of the military staff. Then he's meeting with the Israeli defense minister, Yoav Gallant. Then he's meeting with the president, Yitzhak Herzog. And then he's going to Ramallah, and he's going to be meeting with the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. Hashem was exceptionally interesting there on the details of this Hamas response. We know that this response was passed from Hamas through the Qataris to Mossad and is being picked apart, pored over, analysed by the Israeli leadership right now and will be for hours to come. What we don't know yet is what their response is likely to be. We get the impression from the Qataris that they are optimistic that this is something that can achieve a breakthrough deal. There is less optimism, I think, coming from the Americans, and there is much less optimism coming from the Israelis. Now, the Americans, Blinken is saying that he thinks that a deal is possible and is necessary. But Biden, when asked about it very recently in a press conference, said that he thought that Hamas's demands here were a little bit over the top. In Israel itself, much, much more negative. It is very difficult to square at the moment the details that we are getting from this leaked document and Hamas's overall demand, which is essentially that Israel ends the war in return for exchanges of captives and a ceasefire, etc., with Israel's war goals, which are to keep its occupation in Gaza and to eliminate Hamas as a military force. These two things at the moment do not seem reconcilable, so we may well have more rounds of negotiations to go.
OK, thank you, Rory Challands, reporting from occupied East Jerusalem.